Welcome, everyone. We are very pleased to be joined by Assistant Professor Anil Guven Yuksel, Head of the Department of General Public Law at the Faculty of Law, Ankara Yildirim Beyazit University. He teaches courses in public law and human rights law and holds a PhD focused on the right to participation in social life. Professor Anil Guven Yuksel has conducted international research supported by the DAT and various EU-funded projects. His academic work centers on fundamental rights, comparative constitutionalism, migration, and political participation. He has presented and published extensively in international academic and professional forums. He is a member of the Observatorio de Derecho Público and currently serves as a visiting researcher at the University of Barcelona, as well as a Schumann Fellow at the University of Münster. We are delighted to have him with us today, and thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you very much, Sedat, and good afternoon, everyone. I am very happy to be here with you all. Estoy muy feliz de estar aquí. Muchas gracias. And Zelal, should I start or?
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. So, since Zelal introduced me in every words, I don't need to say anything else, but directly entering into my presentation. My presentation today is actually a part of a broader comparative research project that I have developed through my research stays and predoctoral and postdoctoral works, including across Turkey, Germany, and here in Spain at the end. The focus of this general research is actually the right to participate in political decision-making processes with a specific emphasis at the local level, governance, and alternative forms of political expression, I can say. What I will present today is a synthesis, is a combination of bringing together both theoretical and legal constitutional perspectives, combining the elements of comparative constitutional law, migration law, of course, indeed, and international human rights law. So over these next, hopefully 30 minutes, not more than this one, I will walk you through a sequence of reflections, frameworks, and national context, especially Spain and Turkey, as you already know from the title, to explore the extent, the limits, and the evolving nature of the immigrant political participation, particularly beyond the ballot boxes, let's say. To give you a clear mock-up, pass through. I will begin with some conceptual groundings, exploring how democracy, participation, and citizenship intersect. We will then move into the legal and structural dimensions. After that, I will present a normative and theoretical lens on immigrants as political actors before shifting to the practical modes of participation. We will follow this with a look at international and supranational frameworks, including the EU, UN, and the Council of Europe. Then I will guide you through a comparative analysis of Spain and Turkey. And finally, we will wrap up by examining the institutional landscapes, necessities, such as the role of the courts, political parties, and local governments, before closing with a few conclusions and reflections at the end. So the idea of democratic governance, to begin with, actually, I won't say anything in depth, but I should say that it is built on the fundamental transformations from being the subjects of the power to becoming a citizen, the political actor with the rights, with the voices, and with agencies in the world. So most of us are very familiar with this journey. It's closely tied to the rise of the modern nation states, the emergence of constitutional frameworks, and the growing belief that people should have a say, should have a voice in shaping the political life they are living. So the idea continues to evolve still. In today's world, marked by mobility, pluralism, and global independence, I can say, citizenship no longer defines a homogeneous or static group. Citizens now reflect a diverse political community where the questions of nationality, belonging, and representation are being renegotiated. At this point, we arrive at the core concept that continues to shape the political belongings still, the sovereignty. It remains the backbone of the modern nation states, grounded in autonomy, control, and legitimacy of states to define their own political communities. The nation state, as the institutional form of sovereignty here, gave rise to the social contract idea and with it a narrow framing of citizenship-based political rights. This exclusivity, however, was challenged by the rise of the international human rights law initially, I can say, marking the first normative disruption to state-centric definitions of rights. Still, these legal frameworks, even those driven by human rights values, remain deeply entangled with national boundaries, often justified through concerns of public order, security, or reciprocal obligations. At the same time, the national identity itself is evolving. In recent decades, we've seen some transformations in how the political theory and the practice define the membership again and again, with the emergence of, for example, the post-national, cosmopolitan, or even, and more specifically, the EU citizenship frameworks. As these shifts unfold, participation here is slowly emerging not only as a right for only citizens, but as a human right challenging this long-standing citizen-non-citizen dichotomy. The idea of political membership under this dichotomy becomes especially complex, even more complex, when viewed through the lens of otherness, a recurring theme in public law, democracy, and human rights theories. Terms like alien or foreigners carry powerful implications, often reinforcing the legal and social hierarchies that marginalize immigrants in some senses. Philosophically, the concept of hospitality we can see here helps us reflect on this somehow. For example, while Kant presented the hospitality as a right, Derrida later challenged it by distinguishing between conditional and unconditional hospitality, raising the ethical tensions between welcoming strangers and maintaining the sovereign control at the same time. Arendt, on the other hand, with the idea of right to have the rights, speaks directly to the exclusion of non-members from the legal protection, highlighting the structural failures of the nation-state model when individuals, especially, fall outside of citizenship. Habermas then builds on this, proposing inclusion through discursive understanding, a model of democracy where legitimacy stems from the ability of all voices, including immigrants, to shape the public debate. Finally, I put the major idea of Sheila Ben Habib here, calling for distributive justice, urging us to reimagine the political membership as a fluid and inclusive, grounded not in territory, but in shared responsibilities and participation. So this progression basically helps us rethink how the law and political structure approach the immigrant participation, not just as a legal subject, but as a political actor, I can say. Once individuals are recognized as political actors, after that, bearing some ties, bearing some responsibilities, and contribution to the life of the community, it becomes essential to consider what rights enable this meaningful participation. Here we see the core rights that make up the infrastructure of political participation for immigrants. We can start with the voting and candidacy, access to public employment, participation in local governments, and critically, freedom of expression, assembly and association. And these are complemented by the right to information, which ensures the informed engagement. While these rights may be subject to some limitations in human rights theory and practice, particularly through citizenship-based distinctions, their recognition and protection at a minimum core level is indispensable in upholding democratic principles in diverse societies. But these rights are not equal in function. Some shape public discourse, others determine direct access to decision-making spaces. So instead of leaving them in isolation, we will now turn to their practical influence on political processes to better understand how immigrant participation and how the immigrants participate in these spaces, in these fields, and where the barriers still lie. When we think of political participation, we actually first think that often think that the elections, voting and running for office, of course, these remain vital still, but for many, particularly for the immigrants, access to the elections is often limited and even non-existent in some cases. Here, public administration offers another route through procedures like petitioning, requesting information, or participating in local governments. On the other side, we have the bureaucracy, less visible but deeply influential, because bureaucrats implement the policies, access to public employment, or being heard by public officials can directly impact justice, fairness, and inclusion. That's why I'm dividing these paths to influence the political decision-making in these two different dimensions. But at the heart of all these routes, after these three important points, is political expression. The right to speak, to organize, to dissent. This is often the only accessible tool for immigrants directly and non-citizens. Expression not only fuels the activism, I can say, but it strengthens the political public voice and challenges exclusion. So political influence is multi-phase, and expression rights here often serve as the common pathway connecting all these others. Beyond formal rights lies a broader democratic function, political expression as participation. This means more than just speaking, really. It's about contributing to the public debate, public reasoning, contributing to forming associations, participating in civil society organizations, and shaping the democratic discourse even without the voting rights. For immigrants, especially those outside the electoral framework, this form of participation often becomes the primary way of being politically present. Their voices resonate through economic, social, and cultural dimensions, cultural actions, through protests, through media, through organizing at the community levels. But the real question is, where do we draw the line for the limits? What counts as legitimate political expression for the immigrants? And how do we recognize forms of influence that aren't always codified at national grounds or in the constitutions? That's a bit challenging point we need to face when we think about the participation in plural societies. To fully understand the expression of immigrants, the political expression of immigrants, we must look beyond the domestic framework, initially, I can say. We should look toward the international and supranational developments. Here, I put some examples, I put some highlights from different international and supranational contexts. Firstly, the UN and ILO together, for example, emphasizes that public affairs don't exist in a vacuum. They highlight the active role of associations working for and working with the immigrants, with the communities. Principles like consultation, cooperation, and dialogue offer important benchmarks for this. On the other side, the Council of Europe brings this closer to practice: voting rights at the local level, the political engagement of alliance, and a robust legal framework led by the European Court of Human Rights. Local democracy and public administration are positioned as the meaningful sites of integration in that regard. And finally, the European Union offers us to see a complex picture. The EU citizenship and the participation rights for some, even with the existing legal gaps for the others, especially for the third country nationals. The political parties, institutions, and civic engagement here shape the multiple Europes. Apart from the Council of Europe, there are different Europes now, so that simultaneously we have different application of the European laws here. That's precisely why this study limits the comparative study in the European context, where the legal and institutional developments offer not only some theoretical values, but also practical depth in understanding the evolving forms of participation. So these frameworks taken together help us link some national debates with broader international principles. Here we shift from the theory international practice basically, and I am now offering some strong starting points from the United Nations context, including the ILO contribution to this framework. So here I put some examples from the Human Rights Committee, the general comments from the Human Rights Committee, some remarks from the Special Rapporteur on the migration. Exceptionally, it was warning us against the toxic narratives that vilifies the migrant associations as trades. This stigmatization has real consequences: surveillance, criminalization, and policy exclusion at one side, and states are urged to foster enabling environments, especially for undocumented voices. Also, the Committee on the Migrant Workers highlights, on the other side, how policies like administrative detention create fear and marginalization. In such settings, civil society becomes a lifeline, and restricting it means silencing entire communities. So states should be careful about limiting the rights directly, I can say. So we see clearly that these aren't associations' rights or labor rights only in the framework of United Nations on ILO. They are the tools of political expression in one side, and denying directly them is a denial of democratic participation for the immigrants. On the other side, the Council of Europe frames democracy not just through elections, but through sustained inclusive participation. This is where we begin to see a richer understanding of democratic governance emerge. We see the Venice Commission, we see the former European Committee on Democracy, and now it is Steering Committee on Democracy, and we see the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance. We see the Greta on civil society engagement in multi-layered local policy making, etc. But here stands the question, persisting question, how far can this inclusion go? Here we should have a specific look at the European Convention on Human Rights, because the political voice is protected here, but can it extend to those legally defined aliens? The European Court of Human Rights here provides a cautious yes. But any restriction on expression, assembly, and association must meet the strict standards of necessity and proportionality, even for non-citizens. Let's have a quick and deeper look at the European Convention on Human Rights context. The European Court of Human Rights, I mentioned, says yes, but this yes, it's a cautious, a qualified yes. Article 16 allows states to restrict the political activity of alliance, specifically within the bounds of the Article 10, 11, and 14, which are expression, assembly, and association, and the non-discrimination. But this is not a blank check, I should say. Even when states invoke national security or public order, restrictions must still be justified and subjected to democratic standards. The interpretive framework here is a bit more clear. Are the restrictions relevant, necessary, and proportionate? We all know these steps of the test for the limitations. But on the other side, do they genuinely protect democracy, or do they undermine the political voice of the marginalized groups? Here, Articles 17 and 18 reinforces these points by warning the states. You cannot use the rights to destroy the rights, nor masking illegitimate aims, such as silencing the dissent with legal restrictions. So even in areas where states hold some degree of discretion, the court insists on details structurally. Turning to the European Union content, the story here is not just about voting. It is about building a political community, as we all know and familiar. Since the Maastricht Treaty in 1993, the European Union citizenship has brought rights to vote and stand in both European and local elections, but the legal architecture has gone much further in time. With the Charter of Fundamental Rights and the Lisbon Treaty, the political participation became not just a right, but a structural principle in the European Union governance. And I put some marking point as a legal turning point here last year, because last year the Court of Justice of the European Union ruled that excluding the European Union citizens from the political party membership or joining or establishing political parties violates the EU law. So that this wasn't just about legal access, it was about political membership as a core democratic function, a right to shape the agendas, not just vote on them. So the EU law is now a bit more clear. Participation must extend to the heart of political life, to parties, to civic engagement, to real inclusion, regardless of nationality within the Union, at least. Now that we have explored the theoretical and international foundations in basic forms, we can begin to define a meaningful scope for the political expression in the context of immigrant participation. This includes traditional modes like political parties, assemblies, associations, trade unions, and also the alternative pathways such as grassroots movements, digital platforms, and boycotts. The key, however, lies in balancing the spectrum with restrictions. At the same time, core principles like consultation, cooperation, and dialogue help ensure participation isn't symbolic but substantive. Yet even this structured framework isn't enough on its own. What we encounter in practice is a complex interplay, one that tests the boundaries of non-discrimination, highlighting structural vulnerability, and depends on national protection systems, the constitutions, the courts, and the evolving role of the political parties, I can say. To bring these principles into a sharper focus, I turn to a comparative lens. I'm getting a step back here, examining Spain and Turkey separately and in comparison. These two countries offer us a distinct constitutional tradition, governance and structures, and regional roles. Spain as a EU member with some degree of decentralized administration, and Turkey as a centralized candidate country, even with the frozen relationships across the European Union and the Asia. By analyzing how each protects political participation for immigrants through laws, through courts, through public discourse, we began to see both shared democratic commitments and diverging national practices. This comparison will allow us to assess how deeply the idea of inclusive participation is embedded within each system and how limits, whether legal or practical, reveal the balance between human rights, state sovereignty, and the evolving meaning of the political membership eventually. Spain's, at the first sight, transformation into a major destination country in the late 20th century marked a turning point in its political approach to migration. Initially shaped by historical immigration patterns and a nationality-based model, the country, Spain, tied participation rights tightly to the citizenship. Yet with the transition to the democracy and the EU accession, reform slowly opens space for immigrants, especially through local governments and bilateral agreements, I can say. The Spanish Constitution of 1978 draws a sharp legal boundary between citizens and non-citizens when it comes to the political rights. Article 23, for instance, clearly reserves the voting and candidacy rights for citizens, and the Article 13, the reformed amended Article 13, only extends those rights to foreigners through specific laws or treaties, typically under reciprocity agreements. But this distinction doesn't extend across the board, I can say. There are some articles protecting the right to expression, assembly and association, without limiting them to Spaniards or Spanish nationals. These become the key entry points for immigrants' political voice. At the regional level, the status of autonomy also allows Spain's autonomous communities to go further, making some developing programs and policies that strengthen the inclusion. Spain's legal framework, at the other side, strongly protects political expression for immigrants, not only in principle, but in detailed legislative practices. The cornerstone here was the Ley Orgánica de Extranjeros, which guarantees all foreigners the right to assembly and form associations under the same conditions as nationals. But this is only one part of the picture. Additional organic laws we can see Ley Orgánica on associations, Ley Orgánica on assembly, Ley Orgánica on trade union freedoms, apply broadly with no restrictions based on nationality now. But actually, this flexibility comes from a constitutional court decision of 2007, marking a turning point in affirming that basic authorization to stay cannot be used to deny fundamental rights solely, particularly for freedom of expression, assembly and association to non-citizens, including the undocumented people. The court emphasized that these rights, protected under Article 13 of the Constitution, are grounded in human dignity and Spain's identity, not to the immigration status. The judicial correction here has ensured that immigrant political expression remains constitutionally protected even for the undocumented immigrants in that context. In Spain, on the other side, the political expression of immigrants also takes some shape through a dynamic trio: associations, trade unions, and increasingly political parties, I can say. Associations, some associations, I put some examples here, have become critical platforms during the time, in some periods, I can say, especially in the absence of political rights, mobilizing around issues like local suffrage and labor protections. Some trade unions, on the other side, have amplified these efforts, including during pivotal protests like the 2001 undocumented movement. Political parties, on the other side, have opened some space too. The PSOE and ARC leading early inclusion effects, while the others like PP allowed legal residents to join the political parties later on in 2009. At the local level, especially in autonomous regions, consultative bodies and migrant councils create institutional entry points for immigrant voices. This multi-actor structure offers a visibility, but also reveals a fragmented model where the real inclusion still depends on the openness rather than a cohesive national approach, I can say. On the other side, Turkey gives us another example, having the migration a long approach through the lens of national identity and state control rather than the rights of participation. From the settlement law from the early 20th century, the emphasis has been on the cultural compatibility and the containment, I can say. The Syrian civil war, of course, marked a turning point here, exposing the legal gaps and reinforcing a crisis management mindset. While Turkey hosts millions, especially under temporary protection now, migrants remain excluded from the political life, not because of explicit bans, but because of the system which is built to manage, not to integrate. Participation simply isn't framed as part of migration policy equation. Turkey's constitutional framework draws a firm line, I can say, between the political rights and broader civil liberties. Political rights such as voting, candidacy, or forming political parties are explicitly reserved for the citizens, as outlined in the relevant articles of the Constitution. These articles use the terms like citizens or every Turk, leaving no ambiguity in their exclusion from the non-citizens. Meanwhile, civil aspects of the expression and peaceful assembly are formally extended to everyone in literal words, let's say. However, in practice, these two can be restricted, especially when exercised by the immigrants. Article 13 states that fundamental rights can be limited by law, but Article 16, on the other side, allows the legislator to impose some specific limitations on foreigners. This has led to a legal environment where political expression is often interpreted narrowly for non-citizens in the context of Turkey. The result is a high degree of legislative and executive discretion, I can say, reinforcing a system that treats the political engagement not as a right for immigrants, but as a privilege preserved for the citizens. Turkey's legal framework, accordingly, reinforces the constitutional restrictions on migrant political participation. For example, the law on political parties reserves both party formation and membership strictly to the citizens. Similarly, the law on meetings and demonstrations grants everyone the right to peaceful assembly, but foreigners somehow must first get some prior permission from the Ministry of Interior. The law on associations, on the other side, technically allows non-citizens to form or join associations, but only with legal residency and official approval, creating some procedural hurdles. In principle, some rights are open, but in practice, documentation requirements and ministerial discretion restrict this meaningful participation expression for non-citizens. So in Turkey, we can say the political participation, political expression of the immigrants isn't only shaped by rights on paper. It's constrained by a web of discretionary laws and enforcement practices. The law on foreigners and international protection allows, for example, deportation for vague traits like public order and national security, with no clear definitions. So it gives the authorities wide leeway. Criminal laws, and on the other side, further narrow the space. We have Article 301 punishes the insults to Turkishness. We have the articles targeting speech deemed to glorify crime and incite hatred. So they together fostered a self-censorship. Even in numbers, they are very few. They foster a self-censorship and discourage the public participation, especially when the laws, vague wording, allows for arbitrary enforcement. In this direction, I can say that municipalities are constitutionally autonomous, but this autonomy is constrained by strong central oversight, especially in opposition-led states over these decades. No, this one. It's now a central theme in party platforms and a tool of political signaling. At the local level, this turns into a battleground where opposition parties sometimes mirror the government's rhetorics, focusing on control and repatriation over rights and inclusion. As a result, participatory rights are sidelined in favor of security and loyalty narratives, the same narratives actually with the ruling parties. Cases like the debates in some municipalities in Turkey concerning the discriminatory service fees show how migrants can be politicized even at the municipal levels without a clear rights-based pushback. This dynamic reinforces polarization and it marginalizes migrants from participation and public discourse. So that after examining both the Spain and Turkey contexts, one truth stands out. Assemblies and associations are the starting point of democratic inclusion, but inclusion isn't just about having access. It's about being protected from arbitrariness, being visible in public life. So that's why the courts, political parties, and local governments matter so much. They are the ones who can turn the rights on paper to the rights in practice. Beginning with the courts, we should say that they are the key actors in the architecture of the political participation. On one hand, they ensure the constitutional review, interpreting laws and striking down the measures that violate the participation rights. On the other side, they can help reinforcing the representation, especially when legislative or executive branches fall short. Ultimately, the courts can be interpreters or active guardians of inclusion. There is a preference, I guess, here. How they choose to act and how they are allowed to act has real consequences for migrants seeking political voice. Political parties, on the other side, sit at the intersection of the participatory practices and institutional power. They are not just electoral vehicles. They define who gets to participate and how. For migrants, parties can open doors to visibility and even influence, especially at the local level or through coalition politics. But they can also act as gatekeepers, controlling the candidate list, shaping the public discourse in ways that exclude. Importantly, the relationship mutual, principles shaping how migration is debated, and migration reshapes how democracy is practiced. Inclusion isn't just a matter of access here, it is a test of systems' values. Local government, at the end, sit closest to the communities. They are where the policies meet daily life. For immigrants, this proximity can mean some tailored services and real chances to engage. But local governance is also political terrain. In many countries, cities become platforms for opposition or innovation, especially when national systems are rigid. When local governments work with assemblies and associations, they help carve out participatory spaces, fields, ones that not only serve local needs, but can also reshape national debates from the ground up. So we started with the idea that the democracy depends on political membership, but today mobility challenges the traditional link between citizenship and participation. As people cross the borders, we face a question: how can political communities fairly include those who live among them, even if they are not citizens? That's why participation must go beyond the vote. It must include expression, public service access, public employment access, and presence in decision-making spaces. But inclusion isn't automatic. It requires some safeguards at national practice, I can say. So we turn to legal tools: proportionality, minimum guarantees, and scrutiny. These all help ensure participation isn't just symbolic, but real and fair in practice. We now arrive at the institutional challenge: how to make participation real in systems shaped by both legal protections and exclusions, structural exclusions. International and EU law create openings, but also complexities here, fragmenting protections through categories like citizen, foreigner, or guest. In this space, undocumented migrants remain especially vulnerable, underscoring the need for political voice beyond voting and formal status. Courts, political parties, and local governments each have a role here. In Spain, for example, constitutional jurisprudence has removed residency barriers to freedoms like Assembly and Association. In Turkey, by contrast, similar reforms remain limited, shaped by security narratives and executive discretion. Notably, I should mention that the requirement for prior permission from the Ministry of Interior for the immigrant assemblies in Turkey has never even been challenged constitutionally by the political parties until now. At this point, accordingly, political parties reflect this tension also. They may open up spaces for inclusion or close them, depending on ideology and electoral calculus. Local governments can be transformative, yet opposition-led municipalities often operate under pressure from centralized authority, limiting their democratic innovation. Ultimately, participation is where migration, law, and democracy intersect in some point. To protect the democratic legitimacy understandings, institutions must evolve, ensuring that all citizens, regardless of status, can engage meaningfully in the political life of the community they live, I can say. Thank you so much for